Okay, last time we talked about two economic drivers of Western expansion. We talked about railroads and the settlers they brought, and we talked about mining. Now we want to talk about the two remaining drivers. Number three is ranching. Here we go. So the cowboy is the dominant symbol of the Old West. It's a key to the myth. And the post-war boom in cattle ranching that created the need for cowboys began in southern Texas. I'm having trouble getting my clicker right here. So the Spanish introduced the Longhorn cattle breed there in the 18th century. You see why they're called Longhorns. It's a very hardy breed. They're kind of tough and very enduring, and so they multiplied rapidly. And by the 1850s, there were millions of them that roamed South Texas freely. They were just feral cattle, millions of them. You would think, wow, that's a huge potential resource, but the market for them was limited because railroads were too far away to make shipping them north and east economically feasible. It just didn't make economic sense. So the Civil War changed that. Beef supplies dropped in older states and the price rose dramatically. The post-war population boom and railroad expansion began to encourage people to round up and brand these free cattle. So a branding iron, you see here, would be heated in a fire and then pressed in the flesh of the cow to create a brand so you know what rancher owned the cow. If this seems cruel, by the way, this is in addition to tattoos and body piercings, branding is actually something some people do as a form of body modification. A fortune could be made if the cattle could be driven to the nearest railhead, which was in the early 1860s, Sedalia, Missouri. That's where the railroad stopped. And so in the spring of 1866, cowboys hit the trail with 260,000, eventually, as they picked up cattle along the way, it was 260,000 cattle in one of the first great drives. It was disastrous. Disease, stampedes, bad weather, angry Indians, angry farmers in Missouri. They feared a disease carried by some cattle called Texas fever. They took a devastating toll along the trail. So only a few thousand head made it to Sedalia. But they fetched a huge sum of money. So if only a better route could be found. By 1867, the Kansas Pacific Railroad had reached Abilene, Kansas. Let me back up here. So it used to stop at Sedalia. Now it's here at Abilene. That was 150 miles closer to Texas, allowing herds to be driven through a more sparsely populated area of Indian territory, creating fewer of those problems that plagued the first great drive. So in 1868, a guy named Joseph G. McCoy was a cattle dealer from Illinois. He used his organizational and marketing skills, which were considerable, to create the cattle industry into a new moneymaker. With Plains Indians relocated into reservations and the extension of railroads into Kansas immediately after the Civil War, he reasoned that cattle could be raised cheaply in Texas and brought north for eastern markets. He built a stockyard in Abilene and negotiated a kickback from the railroad of $5 per car of each cattle car shipped. So even if they weren't his cattle, he would get paid $5 a car of cows shipped because he set this whole system up. So it was a win for him and the railroad. He also helped survey and shorten the Chisholm Trail, which was west of the Sedalia Trail, to get cattle to Abilene. And the remaining piece of his plan was to organize the first Wild West show. These are roping and riding exhibitions by sending cowboys to St. Louis and Chicago to recruit more cowboys. About 35,000 head reached Abilene that first summer in 1868, and they were loaded into cattle cars for Kansas City or Chicago. Chicago was already a very large city and was known as the slaughterhouse of America. This gave birth to the interlocking institutions of the cattle drive and Chicago stockyards. The development of refrigerated rail cars in the 1870s allowed Chicago to ship beef all over the country. Now, Abilene grew into a large city overnight. with almost as much liquor coming in as cattle going out. Over the next 4 years, over 1 million cattle were driven along the Chisholm Trail to Abilene and towns further west as the railroad developed, towns like Dodge City. And as buffalo and Indians disappeared, which happened very quickly, more about that later, cattle ranching spread throughout the West. Now, in this era, ranchers grazed their cattle for free on millions of acres of unfenced government land. So, Louisiana Purchase, most of the land in the West was owned by the government, and they allowed this. But because cattle were just roaming around free, they began to, invade farms, and this was a problem for farmers or grangers, an old term for farmers, or ranchers term for farmers, and so and the growing sheep ranchers, and there were range wars that resulted. And when I say war, I'm not being hyperbolic. They literally were wars. In Johnson County, Wyoming, in 1892, grangers and small ranchers, some who got started by rustling or stealing cattle, they defeated the private army of the Stock Growers Association. Here we see the invaders, quote unquote, of the farmers. These men are in custody at a fort in Cheyenne, Wyoming. By then, however, the classic form of open grazing was already in decline. So, the great cattle drives of the 1860s and 70s, which were huge bonanzas for herd owners, but the boom years overstocked the range and drove down prices. This is a classic issue with commodities in this growth era. Huge, millions of acres put under the plow creates a huge increase in supply, which drops the value, and there's a boom, a bust to follow the boom. So the boom years overstocked the range. During the Panic of 1873, America's first great serious depression, we'll talk more about that later, hundreds of cattlemen were unable to get extensions on their loans and were driven into bankruptcy. Record cold and blizzards occurred on the southern range in the winter of 1884 to 85, followed by even worse weather on the northern plains 2 years later. Hundreds of thousands of cattle froze or starved. The cattle bonanza peaked between 1880 and 1885, by which time it had produced more than 4.5 million head for eastern markets. In the expansion of railroads further west, and multiple railroads north and south, ended the need for long cattle drives, and the open range faded into legend. The survivors changed their methods: fencing, growing hay for winter, breeding less hardy because you don't have to drive them hundreds of miles, but tastier kinds of beef. A very few had gotten rich, most did not. Now, little of these bonanza profits were shared by the lowly cowboys. They drove cattle for about $30 a month, the same as common laborers, and had to defend against cattle rustlers, such as William Bonney, also known as Billy the Kid, a very famous cattle thief. So it was hazardous work and low paid. Most were young men who did it for a few years and then moved on to something else. Something you don't really see in old westerns is of the estimated 35 to 55 thousand men who worked the trails in these years, about 20% were black or Mexican. Nat Love, the son of Tennessee slaves, was one such colorful character. Here he is on the left. On July 4th, 1876, very significant date, he participated in a roping and shooting competition in Deadwood, South Dakota, winning both and becoming known as Deadwood Dick, a legend. And a white writer named Edward Wheeler wrote a series of books called The Black Rider of the Black Hills, in which his Deadwood Dick, his fictional version, was called the Black Rider because he dressed in black. Here's an illustration of him on the right. So he co-opted this black man's story, which is obviously racist, and a lot more about that later. So economic driver number 4 is farming. Farming on a large corporate scale. The mining and cattle bonanzas were accompanied by this farming bonanza. By the way, I've used the word bonanza a lot. Bonanza originally meant, a mining term, it meant a rich mass of ore, but it became a a metaphor for any source of great and sudden wealth. So the wheat boom in the Dakota Territory started small, but rapidly attracted large amounts of capital. These were the nation's first agribusinesses. Now, although we talk about farmers and small farmers and have this image of small farms, the vast majority of agricultural production in America, it comes from agribusinesses, large corporations. And this was the start of them. The boom began during the Panic of 1873. Counterintuitively, the failure of banks caused bonds of the Northern Pacific Railroad stock to plummet. So these bonds could be bought for nothing, and the railroad offered land in exchange for these bonds as a way to pay them back. Speculators, including the railroad's president, George W. Cass, bought up a huge amount of acres, more than 300,000 acres in the Red River Valley of North Dakota for 50 cents to $1 per acre. The way they did it, and this is illegal today for a corporate officer to do this, but he would, so his corporation had these defaulted bonds. You could buy them cheap. He bought a bunch of the bonds and then exchanged them for land the railroad owned, because the railroad had huge amounts of land. And they established factory-like 10,000-acre farms, investing heavily in labor and equipment. This is an actual early photo of one such farm in the Red River Valley. The New York Tribune reported that Cass had invested $50,000 and paid all of his expenses plus the cost of the land with his first harvest alone. So this was enormously profitable initially. The success of a few and the resulting publicity led to a wheat boom in the Red River Valley in 1880. Everyone rushed in backed heavily by banks, by credit, borrowed money. North Dakota's population tripled in the 1880s, and the wheat production rose 29 million bushels by the end of the decade. But this boom was followed by a bust because of overproduction, high investment cost, too little or too much rain. This was not ideal territory for growing wheat. Excessive reliance on one crop, and depressed grain prices on the international market. We'll talk more in class about commodities and the pricing perils of producing commodities. Ultimately, large-scale farms were more successful in California's Central Valley. This is the green part, central part of California here. Farmers there built cooperatives to grow and market high-price specialty crops. So these are small farmers that are banding together in a cooperative organization. Specialty crops like cherries, grapes, apricots, oranges. For example, Sunkist is not a corporation. It's the trademark for the California Citrus Growers Association. We'll talk more about this in class as well.